We face a all-star set of challenges and opportunities around the world, but fortunately we have an all-star panel here to address them and to also maybe offer some ideas about how we in this room can help make a difference. So let me briefly introduce the panel and we'll get right to solving the world's problems. So we have the Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Deputy Prime Minister Bettel, Michael Froman, the President of the Council on Foreign Relations, former President Duque of Colombia, former Prime Minister May of the UK, and Admiral Jim Stavridis, former head of NATO. There is some news today. If you've been in your sessions, you may have missed some of the news from the Middle East. Israel has called on 100,000 people to leave East Rafah, apparently in preparation for a ground invasion. And Hamas has said that it accepted a ceasefire offer, but nobody seems to know what exactly the content of that ceasefire is, and Israel says it's not one that is acceptable. So let me just start with that news, and maybe Michael Froman, you can offer a thought about whether there is actually an exit ramp that you see here, or whether this is fated to just continue and continue and continue.
Well, Nick, I'd say the story of the Middle East is one of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the bad right now is, of course, the uncertainty about whether there will be a ceasefire, how long it will last, what will happen to Rafah, and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Obviously, Israel has the right to secure its borders, and it's determined to wipe out Hamas as a military threat to it on its borders. Hamas is fighting from within civilian populations and still has over 100 hostages. And hopefully this modest step of a temporary ceasefire could at least create some breathing room for some diplomacy to happen about how to bring this to an end. I think the longer term question, the medium term question is, what happens to Gaza after the military campaign is over? And is there a governable body there, a place where people can live and survive? And who's going to provide security? And there are no good answers here. Is it Israeli occupation? Is it other countries? Is it a UN force? And who's going to be the governing body? And the last thing I'd say, Nick, is on the good side of the equation is we're seeing more coherence between the Sunni Arab countries, the United States, Israel, around defending the region from Iranian aggression. And that at least holds some possibility that post a ceasefire, that the moderate Arab states could be involved in helping to either provide security, stand up a meaningful Palestinian authority, and get on a longer-term path towards a just solution.
So let me actually follow up with that thought. I mean, there are not a lot of optimists about the Middle East, but those that exist make the point that after the Yom Kippur War, that laid the groundwork for Sadat to go to Israel and change the region. And President Biden is trying to do something similar with a three-way deal with Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the US. To what extent is there a feasible realignment of the entire region with those Gulf Arab states?
Look, I think it's very possible. It began with the Abraham Accords and the continuing discussions. The fact that none of the countries have pulled out of the Abraham Accords, that Saudi Arabia is still interested in reaching an agreement with the United States and Israel is a very positive sign. And then the most concrete sign, with the movement of Israel to CENTCOM and and I'll leave this to the Admiral, the coordination of defense of Israel from Iranian attack, including Jordanian, UAE, and Saudi cooperation, is really quite remarkable, something you would not have expected 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that kind of alignment, where they all have a common interest in pushing back against Iran's destabilizing role in the region, holds some prospect that there could be a positive outcome going forward.
If you want just the brand new information, I just had a phone exchange with the Prime Minister of Qatar and also the Prince Faisal from Saudi. They're waiting for the Israeli answer. So for the moment, it's on the table, and but we need to see if Bibi Netanyahu is going to move on. But just to tell, it will be, at the beginning, it was an attack from the Hamas, so everybody was supportive of Israel. Then, you know, by time, it was difficult to justify what's happening in Gaza, sorry. And so I still believe that we need we have an important moment next week at UN. We will vote if Palestine should be a member or not of the UN, and there will be also the bilateral recognition. I believe that if without a two-state solution, there won't be a solution. So we need to work on, and it's all the time more difficult to justify what's happening when you speak about self-defense and you have over 30,000 people who are dead. So we need to be balanced in both positions, and we are lucky that you said that after the Iran attacks, not all the Muslim countries supported them, but they were isolated. So this helped against on the right side of the decision.
And well, Stavridis, let me ask you about some of those military costs, because I think, I think in the news business, we have this shorthand of people as being pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. In fact, I think most people are fundamentally anti-massacre. And what are the prospects if the Israel Defense Forces go into Rafah that they can actually eradicate Hamas? And I guess if there's a bit of skepticism in my voice, it's because I remember that they thought that they could do that by going into Gaza City. And then they thought they could do that by going into Khan Yunis. And so is there a military victory that is achievable with that invasion in Rafah? And if so, at a reasonable cost?
Well, it's certainly possible that two things can be true at the same time. The first is that Israel was horrifically attacked, brutally and barbarically, and therefore has every right to respond. It is also true that there is an epic humanitarian crisis unfolding in front of our eyes that must be addressed. Both of those things are true. What I'm watching at the moment militarily may surprise you. The center of gravity militarily, in my view, is actually not Hamas, because, Nick, you're right. You can't kill your way to victory in essentially a massive counterinsurgency. The center of gravity is the tunnel complex. 400 miles of tunnel beneath this tiny Gaza Strip. That's where Hamas was able to train, equip, organize, deploy, and direct these horrific attacks. So Israel will continue militarily, believe me, until that tunnel complex is decommissioned. That brings us to kind of the second point, your question, Rafah. I think ultimately the Israelis are going to have to go into Rafah, but how they go in makes a difference. And they will have to begin, and that's what you opened with today, Nick, was doing some level of evacuation to clear the battle space. Incredibly complex military challenge. Possible, yes. Hard, yes. Mission impossible, no. Final thought to the humanitarian point. If you want a quiet, less heard bit of good news, it's that offshore, at sea, the Admiral will say this, we are building a massive pier that will allow the delivery of 150 trucks a day, which is kind of daily minimums for Gaza. That will go into business over the next few days. That is something to watch as well and may help alleviate some of the challenges.
And a follow-up, if I may. As you note, Israel suffered a brutal attack on October 7th. It had not only the right to defend itself, but a responsibility to reestablish deterrence. Was there a military path that would have involved badly degrading Hamas or reestablishing deterrence, achieving some kind of military breakthrough that did not involve the deaths of 14,000 children in Gaza, according to the health authorities there?
Yeah, I think Israel could have taken a more specified, deliberate path inside Gaza, but there was no option militarily that did not involve the IDF entering Gaza, because the Israeli military ultimately needs to turn back to the Israeli people and say, your children are safe in their nurseries, your borders are secure. To get to that point, they had to go in. Hamas knew they would go in. That's why they took hostages, to try and prevent that. Last thought, for the Americans in the crowd, we think about 9/11, a terrible day, 3,000 Americans died. Israel's population is 1/35 that of the United States. When 1,000 plus Israelis died on October 7th, population adjusted, that would have been a 9/11 in America with 35,000 dead. That requires a significant response, in my view.
Lady May, in the US, you may have noticed we have a certain problem with political toxicity and polarization. And President Biden is profoundly unpopular in many quarters. And I think that in this country, we tend to see that as a function of his age. But it's also true that if you look around the world at Western democracies, actually President Biden is one of the more popular. The leaders of the UK, of France, of Japan, of Canada are even less popular than President Biden. And there is deep polarization and toxicity pretty much throughout the Western world. And I think of that sometimes as actually originating in part in the UK with Brexit, which was, of course, one of the chores that you had to deal with as Prime Minister. So I wonder how you see that kind of polarization. I mean, the fact that the Netherlands could end up with electing the party of Geert Wilders astonishes me. And so, I guess I'm less interested maybe in the diagnosis of what went wrong and more in the prescription of how we heal.
Well, first of all, Nick, I'd say that, yes, Brexit, obviously, it meant that the British people were taking two sides of an argument. There was the Remainers, the Leavers, and as you know, the result, 52% to leave, 48% to remain. It was a very close vote. But polarization didn't start there. Polarization had already started in politics around the world. And I think we need to be very concerned about the level of polarization that we see. Because it isn't just about people supporting one political party or another political party. It is leading to what I refer to as an absolutism in our world, which is the sort of idea that if you're 100% with me, you're a saint. If you're 100% against me, unless you're a devil. And there's no sense, or little sense these days, of compromise. And actually, practical politics is often about balance and compromise. And we're seeing too many political arguments which don't understand that and don't accept that. So, and there are elements that are encouraging the polarization. As I look at the US from the UK, and we're starting to see some of this in the UK, that sense that people can tune to a media that is of their political point of view, can read a media that is of their political point of view, can respond to social media that is of their political point of view, and it amplifies their view rather than exposing people to debate, to discussion, to alternative views. And I particularly worry about the impact of social media in this field and the way in which what people see, what people respond to on social media, what people are fed, can increasingly just amplify their view rather than enabling what we all want to happen in a democracy, which is, yes, we have different views. We want to be able respectfully to argue those views, to debate them, and then to come to the best decision.
And so how do we fix that social media problem?
Well, it's difficult to fix a social media problem. I mean, and particularly for young people. I would say don't always listen to it, don't always look at it, don't always pay attention to it. But actually, it can become addictive to young people and constantly sort of looking at their devices and what is on. I'm tempted to say, I can't see everybody here, but there may be some people looking at their devices here in this audience today. So social media companies have a social responsibility. We have we've introduced legislation in the United Kingdom to try to deal with some of these issues. For a much younger generation, I think it's also about education, about educating people to challenge, to be willing to question what is being fed to them, so that they are asking, is that a true view? Is there another view that I can be looking for? And then coming to their own judgments.
President Duque, immigration is certainly one of the issues that has magnified the polarization, magnified the resentments from a lot of working class Americans, and I think Europeans. Your country, I mean, in one country after another, immigration, I think, has been a factor and in this issue. But your country, Colombia, is a exception that has been extraordinary in its willingness to take in Venezuelans, and without, it seems to me, creating this kind of political backlash. And so I wonder, what is the secret?
Well, I don't know if the answer is a secret, but what I can tell you is first where I received the inspiration and how we embraced it. So I remember that I came to the United States in the early 2000s, and I remember there was a temporary protection status for people from Central America that had suffered the damage of, at that time, Hurricane Mitch. And there was a TPS granted. We also saw TPS granted for Haitians. And at that moment, there were a lot of Colombians also requesting eventually a TPS. So I got inspired by that model. And when I ran for the presidency, I said, we have 2 million migrants from Venezuela in Colombia. We need to find a structural solution. And the way that I described the life they were having, it was invisibility. They couldn't open a bank account. They couldn't look for a formal job. They couldn't enter the social security system. And they were living far from any right. So during the pandemic, I told my team we're going to accelerate this because we wanted to do it with more countries, and we had to set an example of fraternity. And I remember that when we were about to launch the policy, many aides said to me, this is going to kill your approval ratings. And I said, I don't care if this is for the sake of solving a humanitarian crisis. And I remember we got a lot of bat, as we call it, because people said, Duque is going to increase unemployment, multidimensional poverty, and informality. We made the decision starting 2021, where we granted full rights for 10 years, with the only exception of political rights, and give them visibility and to participate in the economy. You know what happened in the aftermath? The economy grew at 10.7% in 2021, 8.5% in 2022, and we reduced informality, we reduced unemployment, and we reduced multidimensional poverty. When you embrace the migrants with rights and no obligations, because that was another element, you can definitely make migration a very important force to transform a society. And I want to say this here in the US. One of the most important characteristics of the United States in its history is that it always has been, or for a great part of its history, embraced migrants and brought this talent because people wanted to experience the sense of liberty. I definitely believe that a good fraternal focus on obligations and liberties for the migrants can become a force, especially in the world we live today. If we let our countries be driven by xenophobia or indifference, we will create humanitarian disasters because migration is not going to stop. We're about to see the huge climate migration in the whole planet. Our right migration policy is an essence of democracy.
You also see, though, real pushback from Democrats, Eric Adams and others, who had been much more welcoming when President Trump was in the White House. And I've got to say that, look, I am the son of a refugee from Eastern Europe. But when I go to northern Guatemala and I see all these families who, partly because of climate change, are eager to move to the US, and as one way for them to escape brutal poverty. But I also wonder to what extent we can accommodate these entire villages. And so what is the practical suggestion that you can offer people in those cities that just say, we're willing to open the door so much, but not open it forever?
So I would say there are two approaches that are very important. One is to know what the real trigger of the eagerness to migrate is being created. And definitely, I think there's a labor work shift in the United States. Younger generations in the United States are moving to more digital or virtual kind of job-driven elements in the labor force, while there's still a need for handwork. And the fact is that there are many people who are coming to the United States and are finding those opportunities in works that younger US generations don't want to embrace. That's a fact. But obviously, as you well say, the United States cannot sustain that level of inflow in an indefinite form. How can that be prevented? The only way is to create more opportunities, job opportunities in Latin America. And that's why I think the nearshoring, friendshoring policy of bringing investment, redeploying capital, creating the industrial base, being close to market, can really become a deterrent of massive migration. And that only happens if we work together. And we have seen it. Many people thought that the Venezuelan migrants will directly move to the US. Yes, there has been a number that has moved to the US, but the fact that they could find an opportunity in Colombia based on the pillars that I described allowed us to demonstrate that if we have fraternal policies in Latin America also centered on opportunity, we will deter that idea that the only way to make a better living is just crossing the southern border of the United States. So I'll say friendshoring, nearshoring, but also having better economic conditions in Latin America.
Deputy Prime Minister, the Americans look at Europe these days, and frankly, we see a certain amount of weakness, both economic weakness and also political weakness. And we look at Germany, which traditionally was really a bulwark of the continent, and it doesn't seem to be providing that kind of leadership in the post-Merkel era. To the extent that there is more vibrancy, it seems, and leadership, it seems to be coming more from either the tiny Baltics or Southern Europe seems to be more robust. And so, do you disagree with that perception in the US of Europe to some degree having lost its way? And how does Europe find its path again? How does it, especially if Donald Trump is reelected and fulfills his threats to pull out from NATO, where does Europe summon the gusto to reestablish itself?
So I was Prime Minister for 10 years before being Deputy Prime Minister, so I was at a NATO meeting when Donald Trump was the President in Brussels, where he reminded us the obligations of 2%. The situation, the relations were not always easy because under his 10 years also, I remember when we discussed about the GPDR, about data protection, and so people working digital, they know that for them it was a nightmare, but now the Americans followed us. We have now the DSA, all these regulations that European markets want. And at the beginning, it's always from the USA, this is against us. I remember when we had also discussions about taxations of some companies in the European Union, then it was a reaction that I think champagne was taxed coming from France. So this is, I think, not in the right direction if we just react and give the feeling that we are opponents, because nowadays we should work in the same direction. I worked with Theresa, we were together in the European Council, so that's why I'm wearing still the British socks today, because I remind the difficult job she had during the Brexit. So this was a moment where, in fact, we got divided, because we had to do divorce in the European Union. Usually it was always a honeymoon where everything going right and just having more and more and more and more things in common. The fact is, we show leadership. When there were the attacks in Ukraine, we had sanctions. This was not easy to get unanimity about sanctions. The Paris Agreement, I remember when President Trump said that you didn't want to continue to follow this. I could quote a lot of things where European has shown leadership. I have to admit that in some topics we are really bad. If I see my phones, it's Korean, it's Japanese, it's Chinese, it's American, European. You can find Nokia and Ericsson on the flea markets. So, but we are delayed on those topics. And the fact is, in the USA, when one president makes like this, it's decided. In China, one president makes like this, it's decided. In Russia, one president make like this decide. In Europe, when 27 people put their signature on a paper, we start to discuss. So it's not always easy, but at least we try to find deals and we go in the right direction. But it's a fact that we are a union and of countries with 27 leaders, where maybe, for example, we should have less unanimity and maybe more voting by majority in some topics, especially in foreign affairs, because when I see conflicts, and you spoke about the Middle East, it's China, it's Turkey, it's America, and we are a bit absent, and I think this is not good.
And I mean, I spoke about the American perception of European weakness, but in Europe, to what extent is there a perception of American weakness that we can't get?
I won't tell you. No, I won't tell you, because it's always a feeling of, we are partners. I don't want to be misunderstood, but we see that for the moment we have some partners we can trust. I see during the COVID, we even as partners, we were at airports fighting each other to have masks, to have machines, as partners. And I could continue like that, like all the autonomy, the strategy autonomy that we had when the war started in Ukraine, and we decided not to have Russian gas. It was a nightmare at the beginning with the USA to ask if we could buy LNG and to get it. And so it's always a question of money, but it's also a question of trust. And I think if we would see more as a partner and as a competitor, we know we have, it's official, China is for us a partner, but it's a permanent competitor. Americans are partners, and I see them as trusted partners, and we are very often competitors, but at the end, we know that when we work together, we are stronger. We are a big market, Europe. And with Americans, we should continue to work in the same direction. And very often I have the feeling it's the perceptions. And that's the reason why I'm here. Because after the European elections, we might have a right shift. And if you have elections in the United States and you have also a shift, we will speak a lot about each other, but not to each other. And so that's the reason why Teresa and myself, I think it's important as Europeans to be here, to show that we want to continue the contact, even if sometimes it's not easy.
And if I may, Nick, I mean, I think it's not just you portray it just as how Europe looks at the US or US looks at Europe. This is an issue about the West and the West's willingness to defend its values. And I think what was critical when Putin further invaded Ukraine was that the West actually said, no, we will defend our values, we will come together. The UK, the European Union, the United States said, this is wrong, and we're going to respond to it. And I think that sense of coming together at a point where what we see as sovereignty, democracy is challenged is very important.
And rule of state. It sounds like just 3 words, but important not to forget.
Nick, can I make one quick point on burden sharing? Because we hear a lot about the, quote, freeloading Europeans because they don't hit the 2% of the defense goal. Let me make a point that I think Americans don't appreciate. The largest defense budget in the world is that of the United States, about $950 billion. China's defense budget is $250 billion. Russia's defense budget, about $100 billion, a little bit juiced at the moment. What do you think the collective defense budget of Europe is? Yeah, it's $300 billion. It's the second largest defense budget in the world. Now, can it be apportioned better? Can we encourage all the nations to hit 2%? I think they ultimately will, yes. But as the Deputy Prime Minister said, the Prime Minister said, we are stronger together.
Mike, I think you wanted to...
Yeah, look, I think the question will be at this moment, regardless of what happens here in November, will this moment be one where Europe gets its act together more than it has in the past around defense production, defense procurement? I think we have to note that Europe has done a remarkable job in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Moving off of Russian energy, Germany's had an almost 180-degree turn on defense policy. They've been agile. They have marshaled resources when we've had difficulty getting that through our Congress. But going forward, that's with the U.S. involvement and U.S. support. And if the U.S. support is not there, will Europe be able to step forward? In 2008, the Eurozone and the U.S. economy were exactly the same size, $14.5 trillion. The U.S. economy is now 75% larger than the Eurozone economy. Now, there's some purchasing power parity adjustments to make, but I think the overall point is Europe has not found a path towards growth. And over the long run, the transatlantic relationship is going to be strongest if Europe can be strong and can find that pathway of growth. And we're going to need that when it comes, for example, to dealing with the challenge of China, where we've become much closer in our assessment of China, but we're not exactly in the same place. And I always ask my European friends, you know, yes, we were together on Ukraine, but if China invades Taiwan, will Europe impose a trade embargo on China? And mostly they look at their feet.
I want to add something on the perspective of US, Europe, and also Latin America, and also the global South, because I think the closeness to the US of Latin America and the historical relation with Europe, in some sort of way, I see it starting to be left behind. And this has been capitalized by many who want to affect the global order. So you see the influence of Russia in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, obviously in Cuba, but also trying to use Russian espionage to dismantle many of the bases of Latin American democracies is quite dangerous. And you also see, for example, in the bids of a strategic infrastructure, we're seeing more US companies and European companies not being present. So I also believe that Europe and the US have to think on the West. Latin America is a very important element of the West, critical for energy supplies, critical in food security, but also critical in climate action policies, since we have not only the Amazon basin, but we have almost 70% of the high altitude ecosystems. So I think both have to look strategically at this region, especially because the enemies of the global order want to start affecting the roots of democracy in the region.
One of the challenges in the world today is that Gaza, and to a lesser extent Ukraine, kind of sucks the oxygen out of all kinds of other important issues. And to some extent that has happened in our panel. We're running out of time. But I want to ask each of you, maybe beginning with Admiral Stavridis, if you, just very briefly, if you can offer a thought here to those in the room with their companies, their families, their organizations, what they can do to help address some of these crises and opportunities that we see around the world.
I'll be very brief, and here I want to speak to the Americans in the crowd. All the things we've talked about, Ukraine, Middle East, China, the challenges on our border, all of that we can solve. Our greatest challenge in the United States of America are our internal divisions. So what can we do about them? Long conversation. But I would ask a group like this, as influential as you are, as connected as you are, wherever you are on the political spectrum, be respectful of the other side. Try and have a coherent policy dialogue. Find ways to reach across the aisle. If we do that here in the United States, we can solve many of these problems working with our allies, partners, and friends, some of whom are so ably represented on this panel. Thank you.
Lady May.
I would absolutely echo what Admiral Stavridis has just said. It is so important that we deal with political debate respectfully. But if I may just put in a plug here, because there are businesses represented here. One of the issues that's gone down the political agenda is slavery across the world and human trafficking. And I would ask all businesses here to pay real attention to your supply chains and make sure you do not have forced labor, you do not have labor exploitation, slavery in your supply chains, and you can transform the lives of millions of people around the world.
President Duque?
I think maybe the message is that we need not to take democracy for granted. We're facing a democracy deficit. Almost 70% of the world population live now under authoritarian regimes. The fact is that a decade ago it was 48%. And we need the private sector to be a permanent defender of democracy. We cannot take democracy for granted, and the message is clear. We cannot see a sustainable, prosperous private sector without a system of liberties. And we have to put this in the agenda. I invite the private sector leaders not only to talk with their employees, but among them on how the private sector can be a vibrant voice and defender of democracy worldwide.
Mike Froman.
There are very few issues that we face that the government alone can address, whether it's climate change and the energy transition or pandemics or even national security. It requires the ingenuity, the innovation, the resources of the private sector. The private sector is only going to be able to do that if they can get a good risk-adjusted return on their investment, but we need the private sector focusing on these issues, finding ways to invest so that we can have scalable solutions in each of these areas.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah, we spoke about Ukraine and Russia and also about the Middle East, but I just want to remind that we have conflicts in the Sahel region where there have been coups. Latin America is even less stable than we knew since time. China and Taiwan, it's a mess everywhere. It's a mess everywhere. And we live in a conflicted situation. And I think that we should really try to speak together. We have, for the moment, we speak so much about each other, but not to each other. And we need to find platforms where we're able to exchange. How should we go out of problems if we are not speaking with the people who are in charge of the who are doing a problem? So I know sometimes you are faster when you go alone, but you will go further together. And so we should take time and really think global. And not forget that we are responsible also about how our planet will be. It's not popular when you speak with business people about the planet, but we have no planet B. And the next generation will judge us also on the decisions that we take today.
And my counsel would be for us to check our despair, which seems to be spreading quite a bit in this country and in others, and to remember that we have a history of getting ourselves into messes, but also of getting ourselves out. And there is a backdrop of progress that I think we often don't acknowledge and shouldn't lead to complacency, but to a reminder of the efficacy with which we can address problems. And hopefully, that is part of your presence here at this conference. So with that, please join me in thanking our terrific panel here.
Thank you.
Thank you.